Welcome to the 700 Club. Horrific news from Israel. 3 Israeli fathers were axed to death. Several others were wounded by 2 terrorists heeding a call from Hamas to murder and maim. The fathers leave behind 16 children.
Israeli security forces are on a massive manhunt for the 2 Palestinians suspected of carrying out that brutal rampage. Many fear this attack, which is the 7th in an ongoing wave of terror, could lead Israel into another war with Hamas. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
The terror attack came just at the end of Israel's Independence Day, when Israelis were celebrating the birth of the nation 74 years ago.
We're talking about several crime scenes in the city of Elad. Unfortunately, we have 3 dead people, 3 dead citizens, and several wounded that were taken to hospital.
It was the 7th in a wave of terror attacks in the last 2 months that have killed nearly 20 and wounded dozens. The 3 fathers murdered on Thursday were reportedly in their 30s and 40s and left behind 16 children. And as they have after other terror attacks, Palestinians celebrated in Gaza by passing out candy. Hamas praised Thursday's attack, where the 2 terrorists used an axe to murder and maim. Just days earlier, Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar encouraged Palestinians to attack Israelis and recommended what weapons to use.
Whoever has a gun should prepare it, and whoever does not have a gun should prepare his cleaver, axe, or knife.
He also issued a call to Palestinians in the West Bank to launch more attacks.
Do not wait for a decision by anyone. The lone wolf operations have proven to be extremely successful.
On Memorial Day, just 2 days ago, Israelis stood in silence and remembered those who died in Israel's wars and terrorist strikes. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett used the opportunity to lament how Palestinians through the years have chosen death over life.
If only our enemies had invested in building their future, a tenth of the energy they invest in harming us, their situation would have been completely different. But they choose the sanctification of death, which leaves them wallowed in poverty, misery, and a constant sense of victimhood.
He added a common thread runs through all the waves of terror Israel has suffered through the years.
The characteristics are different, but the motivation remains the same, to turn our lives here in our homeland into hell.
The concern for many here is that this wave of terrorism will lead to another war between Hamas and Israel, just like it did 1 year ago. Gordon?
Well, Chris, I've got to ask, how likely is the war with Hamas?
Well, Gordon, actually, it's a realistic possibility. The circumstances now in May of 2022 are very similar to what it was 20 and 21. That year, the flashpoint was a place called Sheikh Jarrah. I'm sure you remember that, in the Temple Mount. Here we are in May of 2022, the Temple Mount riots, these terror attacks, they're flashpoints. Hamas leader Sinwar, that you saw in our report, he's warning Israel of a religious war. And the speech that he gave several days ago, it was full of incitement. For example, he warned about terror attacks in Jewish synagogues around the world. Because of that now, Israeli officials have warned Sinwar of possible retaliation following all these series of terror attacks. And they consider him a terror instigator, say they'll respond accordingly, and they're going to hold him responsible for urging these Palestinians, Arab Israelis to commit these terror attacks, which means Israel feels like it has freedom of action in the Gaza Strip. So Gordon, it's possible this situation could ramp up into another war, just like last year.
Well, it's quite clear it's incitement, and it's incitement to murder people. When is the world going to deal with the underlying ideology here? It seems like we're just trying to placate the Palestinians, and this has been going on now for decades. When are we clearly going to address this ideology and say this is absolute evil?
Well, that's a great question, Gordon, and it remains to be seen. You know, we have talked about this. We've reported on this on CBN News for years, actually. I can go back to 2000 and remember some of the reports about incitement. I think sometimes the Western powers just don't hold the Palestinian Authority, which also incites, or Hamas of what they say. And you can see just a direct parallel between what Sinwar said the other day about using axes and knives. And here we are just last night when an axe was used to murder and maim these three fathers and then wound many more. But I think that the world does need to wake up to know what is being said. It's being said in Arabic, but they need to understand the translation into English.
Well, what does this do for the fragile coalition for Israel's government? How do you see this playing out in their elections?
Well, it puts the coalition in very fragile condition right now. It's lasted now about 11 months. Some people will last a month, 2, 3 months. They go back into the Knesset just in about a week, and then they're going to have actually a vote for a no confidence vote. So it doesn't seem like it's going to last much longer. One of the really key moments right now, Gordon, is the fact that Mansour Abbas, he's the head of an Islamist party. He's under enormous pressure to leave the coalition. In fact, Sinwar called Abbas out by name and blamed him for providing a security net for Israel's government because his 4 seats are critical to keep the coalition together. He blames him for standing with the government that's desecrated the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So Sinwar says it's a crime they can't forgive. So if Abbas leaves the coalition with his 1, 2, or 4 seats in total that he has, it's really going to lead to a collapse of the government, and then we may be leading to new elections here in Israel.
Well, Chris, thanks for the insights. Thanks for the report from Jerusalem. And let me remind everyone, this is an ideology, and it goes back a long time. This isn't something new. The radicalization happened in the 1950s. Before that, they really didn't even identify as Palestinians. It was the PLO being created in Egypt that actually started that movement, and that was in the 1950s. And it was started with someone who wasn't even from Palestine, which is, you get into the history here and the weaving of lies back and forth over time that has become generational and become an identity and a truth for the people living there now. We have to come against these ideas. The idea to drive Israel into the sea is a lie. Israel has every right under international law to exist. The idea that you somehow get merit in heaven by killing Jews is an absolute lie. These things have to be confronted by the entire world and say, no, you've been sold something for generations. And I'll echo what the Prime Minister of Israel just said. It has trapped you in poverty and misery. It is your own fault you're there. It has nothing to do with Israel. If you had wanted another state, you could have had one in 1948. You could have had one in 1967. You could have had one in 1973. Let me go through all the Oslo Accords, all of it. You could have had one. And here's the irony of ironies. Israel would have given you Jerusalem. But because of the hardness of your heart, you refused it. In that, you have to recognize, look in the mirror, blame yourself for where you are.